So this video will continue our exploration of violence in human nature, focusing on what Zinn has to say about the claim that violence is part of human nature. So here's an outline of what we'll look at when discussing Zinn. We'll first consider what he says about arguments from anthropology for the claim that violence is part of human nature, then what he has to say about arguments from ethology for the claim that violence is a part of human nature, and then we'll do the same for arguments from biology, psychology, and history. So we'll start by looking at the argument from anthropology. So the idea underlying the argument from anthropology goes something like this. Places where people live in the state of nature are terribly violent. If places where people live in the state of nature are terribly violent, then H is true. Therefore, H is true. Now, the second premise is right. If places where people live in the state of nature are terribly violent, then when you don't have government, there's a wide range of circumstances in which people will be violent on a regular basis and a narrow range of circumstances in which they won't. What about premise one? Well, Zinn says that contrary to premise one, anthropologists find extensive variation in cultures without what Hobbes would call government, that is, cultures that are in the state of nature. And moreover, you find that when such cultures are especially violent, they tend to be in especially dire circumstances. So native peoples living in the southeastern United States prior to Columbus's arrival were living in a place that was fairly easy to live, good soil, good seasons, and so on and so forth, and they were pretty darn peaceful. By contrast, you can find examples of places around the world where living was extremely difficult. Resources were extremely scarce. Population outstripped resources by a long shot. And those cultures tended to be violent. So, says Zinn, it's not that there's a wide range of circumstances in which people will be violent, or a narrow range of circumstances in which people will be violent. It's rather that when resources are fairly abundant, people tend to be peaceful, and when they're fairly scarce, people tend to be violent. So Zinn concludes, the first premise of the argument from anthropology is false. Now let's look at the argument from ethology. Here's the idea. Non-humans are typically vicious towards members of their own species. If that's right, since humans are just another species, humans are probably typically violent towards members of their own species as well. Therefore, humans are typically violent towards members of their own species as well. Here's Zinn's rebuttal. He says that contrary to one, animal studies find no pervasive species instinct toward violence. This is quite true, in fact. Most species don't engage in regular and systematic violent behavior towards one another. There isn't a wide range of circumstances in which wolves will be violent towards other wolves and a narrow range in which they won't. There isn't a wide range of circumstances in which ants will be violent towards members of their own species, but a narrow range in which they won't, and so on and so forth. Instead, there's large, complex ant colonies in which ants aren't violent towards one another. There's sizable wolf packs in which wolves are only minimally violent towards one another, and so on and so forth. Zinn also notes that findings regarding non-human animals don't always apply to humans, not because we aren't animals, not because we're something importantly distinct from the animal kingdom, or that we're a different kind of species altogether, but just because there are differences. And that's why, for example, when you do clinical drug trials, after you do them on animals, you don't jump straight to approving them for all humans. You need to do trials on humans, because sometimes you find that what happened in non-human animals doesn't happen in humans. So Zinn also sort of considers rejecting the second premise. How about the argument from biology? Here's the idea. Humans are innately aggressive. That is, biology shows that it's part of our genes to be aggressive. If that's right, then H is true, therefore H is true. And in considering the claim that humans are innately aggressive, Zinn notes that E.O. Wilson has advanced this claim. E.O. Wilson is a famous Harvard biologist, now retired, I believe, but was a famous Harvard biologist. Here's how Zinn counters. He says, when you look at what Wilson actually argues when defending the claim that humans are innately aggressive, he defines innateness as the measurable probability that a trait will develop in a specified set of environments. Consequently, when Wilson says that humans are innately aggressive, he's really just saying this, that there is some measurable probability that people will be aggressive in some circumstances. Or put another way, many people will act aggressively some of the time in some circumstances. Well, that's certainly not enough to support the claim that absent government, there's a wide range of circumstances in which humans will frequently be violent towards one another, but a narrow range in which they won't. And Zinn correctly thinks that's not enough to support H. So we lose the first premise. That is, not that it's false, but that we have no reason to believe it. Here, Zinn also cites another famous Harvard biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, who writes, what is the direct evidence for genetic control of specific human social behaviors, such as violence and aggression? At the moment, he says, the answer is none whatever. Now we're going to stop there for this time. Next time we'll continue by looking at the argument from psychology.